welcome. If this is your first time with us, the K-12 Outreach Program at ILS promotes the history and culture of Latin America and the Caribbean in New York City classrooms, mainly. But it often happens that the issues that we touch on here are similar to those in other parts of the US. So it's always enriching to have people from other states. And I believe even countries with us tonight. I think so, yes. So every year, the K-12 Outreach Program organizes events and activities related to its goals, the goals that I just mentioned. And the most emblematic of our outcomes is the production of a resource guide for teachers to make use of Latin American history and culture in their classrooms, and also from the Caribbean. This year, our guide is called Leveraging Latin American Cultural and Linguistic Diversity for Academic Achievement, and it is a professional development guide. We are very lucky to have the author of the guide with us, Amanda Earl. Amanda is an EDD candidate, so a Doctor of Education candidate in the International Educational Development Program at Teachers College, Columbia University. At Columbia, Amanda received a fellowship, thanks to which she became a student of Nahuatl, one of Mexico's 68 national languages, and the language of the Aztec Empire. Studying this language has influenced and enhanced her doctoral research. Her overall interests include educational policies and teaching practices that affect multilingual students, particularly rural and indigenous students in Latin America and recent immigrant students in the US. This past year, Amanda was living in Ixhuatlan de Madero, Veracruz, Mexico, to conduct her dissertation fieldwork, during which time she was living and working with rural youth and educators who were speakers and or learners of not only Nahuatl, but also Otomi and Tepewa, two other languages indigenous to what is now Mexico. Amanda has worked as an educator or in education policy for over 10 years, both as a language teacher of grades 6 to 12 in Philadelphia and in college access for recent immigrant high school students in New York City. Amanda also spent some time working in community development in Argentina before coming to Columbia. So thank you very much for being with us and for your wonderful guide, Amanda.
Thanks for having me.
That is Amanda. I will just begin this presentation by introducing you to the guide structure, and then I will pass the mic to Amanda, who will introduce you to the guide in a more hands-on way, and keeping in mind that the current need of teachers to implement activities for the students online that are also culturally relevant for them and keep them involved to succeed. This will take approximately 30 to 40 minutes, and the rest of the time will be devoted to comments and questions. If you want to ask a question, you may raise your hand on Zoom if you know how to do that. Otherwise, you may just write down your questions on the chat when the Q&A time comes. And if it's few of us, we may be even able just to speak up, but we will see how this develops. You are also free and actually encouraged to use the chat to post comments all throughout the presentation. And we hope that this chat space also allows you to exchange experiences among yourselves. So let's go now to the guide. The guide is available for free use and download on ILS's website. I don't know if everybody received the correct link because we recently changed the website. We improved it, so I am posting it here. And so you can access the guide there. I hope everybody can follow. I'm going to give you a few minutes if you want to open it. If everything is good. Okay, so there you have the guide. Everybody has the guide. Can everybody just say yes, or if anybody has any question, just please, you can post them on the chat. Okay, great. All right, so, all right. As you will see on page 7, you don't have to go, but I'm just letting you know that these are Amanda's words. In 2017, there were nearly 45 million foreign-born individuals in the US, representing 13.7% of the population. In urban centers such as New York City, the pluricultural nature of our US communities is even more marked, with over 1/3 of residents born outside the US. The composition of US schools reflects this growing diversity, with immigrants and their children arriving to schools and increasing their cultural and linguistic richness. On page 8, if you scroll down, you will see a chart with the linguistic diversity of the city in general. Spanish, but also many other languages are there. You can see that it's 174 other languages. And so some of these are also from Latin America. It's not only Spanish. This linguistic diversity can also be seen on the Endangered Language Alliance's website. You will find this resource in your guide as you explore it later, but I can share with you my, my screen. Let me see if I can do this. And to show you how great this resource is if you are not familiar with it. There we go. So this is a map of New York City, of the languages of New York City. And you can zoom in. This resource is in your guide again. And you can see that it's not only the UN varieties, right, of languages, but you will see that there is diversity within Spanish, Ecuadorian Spanish here in the Bronx, Mexican Spanish, Dominican Spanish, but also you will see that there are other languages like Ecuadorian Quechua spoken in New York City, some other languages in today's Mexico, Tlapanec, Mixtec, Zapotec, Otomi. You will see the same thing in Manhattan here with a few Mexican languages here. You have Puerto Rican Spanish, down here as well, some Spanglish. When you go to Queens, you will see Colombian Spanish. You'll see a community of Brazilian Portuguese. You will see Central American Spanish here. Of course, you will see also the variety of the Caribbean languages spoken in New York City, which we do not explore in the guide, but we do mention because it's also a variety coming from the region. We see, if we go to Brooklyn, again, Mexican Spanish. We see some Maya varieties or varieties close to that family. And even in Staten Island, you will see a few languages from Mexico. So this is the context in which New York City teachers have to teach. And we are aware of this. So, given the situation, and once again using Amanda's words, the following guide contains background theoretical context and both activities for educators and teachers to complete themselves as professional development, as well as accompanying activities for them to implement with students of various grade levels. But feel free to use your imagination to adapt the activities to your classroom and subject. So if we go to the guide, if you go to the table of contents, that would be, I don't know if that has a, I don't think it has a page, but of the guide, and there we go. So if you go to the table of contents, you will see that this is, usually the structure is divided into 3 parts. You will have a theoretical part, an activity, and a section that says from Latin America to your classroom. These activities are different in colors. These sections. The activity is in yellow, so you'll always see activities in yellow. And you will see also the activity from the section from Latin America to your classroom in blue. And in addition to that, you will have pink boxes every now and then in the guide. These are teacher takeaways, and they are additional resources or additional tips for you to follow up on the topics that are contained in the guide. So that is basically the structure of the guide. And also, you will see that each activity, the ones that are in yellow, will suggest the K through 12 level or levels in subject or subjects where it may be applied. And of course, again, you can feel free to use whatever suits your needs, whatever meets your needs. And I think that is it for the basics of the guide. So now I will give the floor to Amanda to really have you immersed, to give you this immersion experience on the guides.
Well, thanks, Romina, for everything and for all your help in the creation of the guide. And I just want to say welcome to everyone who's joining us. I'm so glad that you've found the time in your busy schedules, and I hope all of you are keeping safe and well wherever you are at the start of a busy semester. And a special shout out to all those who might be teachers, either who've already started or who are about to go back into the classroom. Thank you for all that you do. I would say not only, when Romina was showing the map of all the language diversity in New York City, and of course, there's a ton of diversity across the country. I was thinking, not only do we have to teach in this kind of context, but we get to teach in this kind of context, which is really exciting. There's a lot we can do to kind of explore students' multilingual backgrounds and multicultural backgrounds. So I also think, even though in past years, these presentations have been done in person, the nice thing is that maybe some of you are able to join us tonight that wouldn't be able to join us otherwise through Zoom. One of the silver linings of the life that we're living these days. So given this format, if you guys want just to create a little bit more of a sense of community on the short call, if you want to type into the chat box, maybe where you're joining us from, city or country, and perhaps even if you want to include like what role you have, whether you're a teacher and for what age group, or if you're an administrator or working in some sort of other organization, we'd love to know. And I'd love to know. As Romina mentioned, our goal for this short time, because we have very little time, is really not to go through the guide in its entirety. You can do that on your own and feel free to choose the sections or resources that help you in your own particular practice. I'm just really here to give you some context on why and how the guide was created and a preview of an activity or two, and hopefully the activities will be a bit interactive, so get ready. And then we'd love to open it up to questions, and more than questions, really comments and conversation. I think it's always nice when educators or people interested in education can kind of brainstorm together. So regarding the origin of the guide, I have a bunch of special thanks to send out. One to Professor Regina Cortina, who is a professor of education at Teachers College at Columbia. She supported the creation of a 2-day workshop that this guide was mainly based off of. And extra special tons of thanks to Marta Rosas, who is actually on the call with us today. I don't want to put her on the spot, but she was the co-creator with me of the workshop that I mentioned, and I consider her my co-author, even though she's not listed as such. So she created some of the activities that you see in the guide, and certainly was a major influence on it. So thank you, Marta, for your help. So the workshop that we originally created was primarily geared towards educators working at nonprofit or NGOs that might be coming into work in formal classrooms, such as like arts programs or arts teachers who come into formal classrooms, who might have a lot of in-depth subject knowledge, but maybe not so much formal pedagogical training in culturally relevant pedagogy or language acquisition, or maybe not so much familiarity with Latin America and its school systems. I myself kind of went through this experience, which is why I wanted to work on this workshop and guide. In New York City, I was working for a nonprofit and going into a public high school classroom that was at a high school for recent immigrant students. And I found myself kind of instinctively adapting the curricular materials I was given by my organization, but I felt like I was kind of lacking the educational theory and research to kind of back up my instinctual choices, both to the school that I was working at, but also to the organization to kind of advocate for change at a more organizational level, and also to parents even. So that is kind of one of the reasons why I decided to work on the workshop and also produce the guide. It's also another reason why you don't see, like, the information is, as Romina mentioned, is not necessarily geared towards a specific age group or subject. I think most of the activities can be tweaked and used in a variety of contexts and with a variety of different age levels. So as for the body of the guide, it's largely organized to support educators in three main ways. The first is the one I just mentioned, really to connect educational and linguistic theory to practice to support the incorporation of students' funds of knowledge. So for instance, it's very well documented that using Spanish or other home languages of students helps them access and understand academic content and is just overall beneficial to them cognitively and emotionally. Even allowing them to translanguage in the classroom will not harm but help their language acquisition. But sometimes, as educators are all too aware, popular discourse or fear kind of tells people the opposite. So again, the first main goal was just to give people some language around theories and how they support the use of multimodal and multilingual teaching strategies in formal academic instruction, so that teachers can validate a lot of times what they're already doing to parents, administrators, and other stakeholders. The second main goal for the guide was, or the second thing that the guide really does, is to dispel some common myths about diversity in general, and particularly about English learners and students and families of Latin American background in particular. For instance, that they all are Spanish speakers, right? Which might be obvious to those of us who are working in classrooms, but maybe not obvious to people in general, or just known. There's also a section, for example, in that part of the guide on Afro-descendants of Latin America, which have all too frequently been overlooked in both research and practice, and statistics. This section also has activities to encourage the recognition that diversity can show up in a number of different ways, that we're all diverse. And so there are some activities that allow teachers and students to dive into that in more depth together. There's also considerable discussion of translanguaging in the guide. One common pushback I hear is that it's impractical to implement. And by translanguaging, I'm referring to allowing students to draw on all of the linguistic repertoire they have from whatever languages they know and use inside the formal classroom. So I aimed to provide a few concrete strategies to do that. And there are also many other experts, including Ofelia Garcia, one of the foremost experts on translanguaging. Her works are listed as resources in the guide. And then lastly, a third need we tried to address, and then we're gonna try out a short interactive activity, so get ready. The third need we tried to address is really the social emotional stresses and trauma that many students of Latin America and Latinx backgrounds face in school settings. They're certainly not the only ones, but while some of that is often more appropriately addressed by counselors and those with formal training in psychology, the last part of the guide does aim to provide some context regarding maybe the different attitudes and social emotional needs that students of Latin American background might arrive to school with, especially if they're coming from a different school system in Latin America and they or their parents are expecting things to be a particular way in the school setting. And there's some suggested activities also in that section, the last section, to promote student activism in order to boost their self-confidence and agency, because there's quite a bit of research out there that suggests that engaging in social activism helps students to cope with trauma. So being responsive to all the students in your classroom is challenging. And I'm assuming, especially given the time and resources at our disposal, and I'm sure that's a part of the reason why at least some of you are here today and interested in this guide. So if we could, I'd like to take a few minutes to reflect on the challenges that might have brought you here today. And we were expecting, a lot of people registered. I think we have a manageable number of participants, so we might be able to have more participation than I was originally thinking. But Romina, if you could share your screen and pull up the first slide on the PowerPoint, that would be great. I'll give you a second to do that. So individually, keeping yourselves on mute for a second, I'm going to ask you to take about 2 minutes. I'll give you 2 minutes to think about one challenge, or if you have time, you can think of more than one challenge that's either associated with teaching students of multiple cultural or linguistic backgrounds, or a challenge inherent in incorporating those backgrounds into the classroom. So this could be a challenge that either an individual student might face, or a challenge that you as a teacher or even at a school or organizational level face. So I have one example up on this virtual Post-it note. For example, I have a student in my classroom who is coming from Central America and might have interrupted formal education or be labeled as a SIFE student. Another challenge at the teacher level could be, I don't speak the same language as my student's parent and I need to communicate with them. So just silently, let's take 2 minutes to reflect, and you can feel free to type your challenge if you'd like to share into the chat box.
For those who just joined us, okay.
For those who just
okay. So for those, sorry about that. Thank you. For those who just joined us, we are in the middle of an activity. That's why we're silent.
So now's a great time to start posting a challenge in the chat box if you'd like. Or I think if you'd like, you can unmute yourself and maybe share a challenge that you've encountered in your own practice or experience, or maybe a challenge you've also encountered just as a student yourself. Okay, so I see someone has typed in, a challenge is, I might not have the same cultural knowledge as some of my students. Exactly. I mean, we all come from different cultural backgrounds and homes. So we might not know what awaits us in the school building or from our peers. Is anyone else brave enough to speak to us out loud? No. Okay, great. The good news is there's going to be another opportunity to share with us at a point that'll be much more exciting. So I'd ask you to just sit with those challenges.
Okay, well, sorry, Amanda, to interrupt you. I think somebody raised their hand.
Oh, okay. Would you like to unmute them so they can share?
Hi, it was me. This is Beatrice. I wanted, because, I'm from here, from San Juan, Puerto Rico. So we obviously we speak Spanish here. It's our first language.
Sure.
But I find interesting that I do have students, I get students that have interrupted formal education, because we do get, immigrants here from different countries. So we do have that even with Spanish speaking countries. Their level of education may not be the same. And I'm an English teacher, so I see that clearly as they come into my classroom. I teach middle school and high school, and we have to kind of work with them with the English language. And then I have students who are Puerto Ricans who come from probably a public school that's not, doesn't really have that good educational structure. They come to my school on a scholarship, and we don't speak the same language. Their parents don't understand me. They don't have that formal education. So it's interesting that, even within whole Spanish speaking population, we do have this
Thank you.
present.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And thank you for bringing that up. It's wonderful that you're joining us. And yeah, what you're saying makes me think too that, it's also it kind of proves a lot of the theory that's talked about in the guide, right? That no matter which language you're targeting to develop, you can see when students have gaps in their academic literacy, right, in their first language or their home language. So that's really why strengthening both or multiple languages can be overall beneficial. I mean, the question is how to do that. So thank you so much for sharing. I'm going to move on for the sake of time to explain that really the conceptual framework of this guide, or the perspective from which it was written, which you can find an explanation of it starting on page 13, is really based on two important concepts that are basic, but I think fundamental. So one is of the value of the funds of knowledge of all students. In other words, that Latin American and Latinx students, whether they are English learners or not, or whatever their first languages might be, they and their communities possess literacies, practices, and experiences that are valuable forms of knowledge, even if they're not the dominant forms of knowledge of the classroom. And I think it's essential to recognize that in most cases, they're not. In a lot of cases, they're not. And that they should be recognized and utilized by both teachers and other students and peers. So for instance, the first activity and the From a Latin America to Your Classroom section on page 17 of the guide shows some examples of objects from Latin America that represent important, or at least kind of common knowledge that maybe some of your students have at home or could relate to. So those are just some examples. To demonstrate, and I bring this up because I think part of our work as educators is really not to be transmitters, but rather to work as conduits between home and school practices. And that's really what undergirds a lot of the activities in this guide. Funds of knowledge and a strengths-based perspective really go hand in hand, because it's impossible to recognize and value the practices and literacies and multiple languages of our students that our students bring from home if we don't believe and understand why they are strengths to be leveraged and how they can help our students academically. So Romina, if you'd like to put up the second slide, please. And what I'm going to ask you to do now is take a minute or two, and this is the fun and interesting part, to take whatever main challenge you thought of and think about how you can turn it into a strength or reframe it as a strength. So for instance, my SIFE example, or a student with with interrupted formal education, that student might, be lagging behind grade level, but they most certainly do have experience outside of the classroom, maybe a migration story or work experience that certainly enhances their worldly knowledge and might have made them, for instance, more aware of socio-political issues. So that's a way of reframing that as a strength. And the second example, I can't speak the same language as the parents of one of my students, but on the flip side of things, that parent that student has a double language resource, in that they have a parent or maybe a guardian who can speak or read to that child in a language besides English to enhance their multilingual skills, right? thus supplementing the work that I'm doing in the classroom in English, for instance. So I'll give you another minute. And if anyone wants to share how they might turn their challenge into a strength, either in the chat or vocally, that would be great.
Placeholders.
Okay, it's often difficult because teaching is a difficult endeavor and challenging endeavor to turn some of these challenges into strengths, and you might want to continue to think about those things. For the sake of time, unless anyone is dying to share right now, or maybe we can share at the end, I'm just going to move on because there's one other activity I'm dying to share with you guys interactively before we open it up to questions. So thank you. And, you know, I just want to say, I think that the recognition that the funds of knowledge and strength-based perspective might sound like fuzzy, warm and fuzzy and less than practical, but I think we know as teachers that our attitudes matter quite a bit. They affect our words and teaching styles, which in turn affect the emotional and cognitive states of our students. So I'll give you an example that I commonly came across when I was working in Mexico this year among some students and families who were Nahuatl speakers. They were always at first totally shocked and then delighted and clearly proud a few minutes later when they heard that I was learning Nahuatl at a university in New York City. So of course, on the one hand, that was great. It also shows the unequal power dynamics and racism that exist in the society they're living in, since a lot of them have been socialized to think that Nahuatl has no place on the international or global scene, much less in a university. But I think that's exactly why it means so much when teachers who are in relative positions of power can recognize language. Even it's not like I'm a speaker of Nahuatl, but just to know that I was interested in learning it really empowered the students I was working with. So I think a little bit can go a long way in some of these cases. Before I move on to highlight one more activity from the guide and take questions or conversation, I just wanted to add an additional note about the idea of funds of knowledge. I think that the time that we're living in addition to making more salient many inequalities that exist in the world, I think one of the things that we're living, you know, that our global situation now confirms very clearly that advocates of culturally relevant pedagogy have been pointing out for years is the central role of home and community practices in education. And that's especially true for the millions of students around the globe, not to mention in our country, who still don't have access to high-speed internet or really great ways of learning online. When I was in rural Mexico this year, many of them did not have, you know, they're not sitting at home in rooms that look like classrooms or in front of screens in many cases, right? Very few of them had access to the internet at home or even in their communities, and even access to a cell phone was limited. So the professors that I was working with at the university there were having these students go into the fields with their fathers and cousins or uncles and document the use of agrochemicals and fertilizers, documenting which crops or plants used to be grown and used by the community that are now brought from elsewhere as part of a class on rural sustainable development. So that's just one example, but it's just struck me as particularly interesting or curious that especially when schools were first closed down, there were a lot of articles and op-eds coming out. And I even saw my own friends who are parents posting photos of how they were setting up their own homes to look like classrooms, right? To mimic the classrooms that children are accustomed to seeing in traditional school buildings. but it's, and that's all well and good, and children need consistency, right, and continuity, and I'm certainly not knocking parents, but I think it's a really opportune moment to reimagine the spaces that we call classrooms, what they look like, and what and whom they should contain, what knowledge they should contain, right? Why do we have to follow a certain schedule with one resource? These kinds of things, right? So hopefully this guide and the activities within it can kind of facilitate that rethinking process. So there's one more activity that I'd love to show you. And it's the last activity in the guide, which is activity number 8, the Dreamline project. So Romina, if you could go to the next slide. The Dreamline project, I included this here in the section around socio-emotional skills because it's a fundamental way to leverage the particular backgrounds. A fundamental way to leverage the backgrounds of our students is to connect academic content with what they want to achieve in the wider world, right? And what matters to them at a personal and community level. So this is a great project to carry out with students of really any age. I've seen it done with from elementary, even preschool, to college age students. I've done it with college age students myself to develop their self-awareness, global empathy, and visions for the future. It's also easy to carry out completely virtually online. So I thought it would be a good one to preview with you today. And also it lends itself incredibly well to multilingualism, which I'll show you right now. So basically Dreamline is a nonprofit. So there's a website you can visit to learn how to implement the project. It's free to sign up for and free to do. The founder of the nonprofit, his name is Jeffrey Harlan. He's a good friend of mine and former colleague. He's a career teacher from Philadelphia. And so basically the way the program works is teachers help support students to reflect on their personal values, what they care about most. They express this on a standard sized piece of paper or cloth in a creative or artistic way. That's what we call a Dreamline banner. And then teachers are able to upload photos of those banners safely and securely by downloading a free app that Dreamline has. And so that students and other teachers around the world who are part of the program can look at each other's dreams and reflect on what they have in common. So I think the best way, the students' voices often speak best for themselves. So I'm going to show you a few examples, and then we'll have about 15 to 20 minutes for questions and conversation. So Romina, I'm going to start sharing my screen. Can you see it? Yeah, okay, great. So this is an example of a Dreamline banner, and you can see it's on a piece of cloth. So physically, when at a time when we are able to be with students physically, then we can string the banners together on a line, which is where the name Dreamline comes from. But they're also strung together online on the gallery of the Dreamline website. So this is an example of one flag that's been uploaded to the Dreamline website. And the really cool thing about this is not only can students read each other's flags, but they can also hear them and even hear them being spoken in a language that might not be their own. So I'm going to play this flag for you.
Para noche, maki ismatica ni náhuatl ipa noche ni tlaltepactle ni kamati ni náhuatl.
So that student, as you might have guessed, I don't know if you could hear it, he was speaking in his first language, which is Nahuatl, and he chose to make his flag completely in Nahuatl. And then what's cool is that there's a translation of the flag at the bottom, and we had a deliberate conversation with this because one of the options was to translate the Nahuatl into Spanish, which is typically what's done. But together with the professors at the university I was doing this at and the students, we decided, you know, it's going to make a political statement if we translate the Nahuatl directly into English, because we don't need to use the colonial language to go through, right? So that was the decision we made. Plus, you know, now a lot of students who know English or who are learning English throughout the world can read and understand that flag. Here's another one from a classmate of his. I'll play it for you.
Quiero un mundo sin corrupción. El peor enemigo de tu educación es la corrupción. Quiero unión en las familias. Una casa dividida en contra de sí misma no puede sostenerse.
So what I love about this one is she chose to write in Spanish because she's not a Nahuatl speaker, although she's from a nearby community. But if you look down at the bottom, you can see that she wrote Las Kamatimiak on her flag, which means thank you very much in Nahuatl. So in the course of making the flags, the students really encouraged each other to kind of translanguage and use all the languages of the classroom, which I thought was cool. And you might also notice that the flags, some of them are tagged with a hashtag an SDG, which stands for Sustainable Development Goal. So as part of this project in the class, we had a conversation around the Sustainable Development Global Sustainable Development Goals and how their dreams or values lined up with those global goals. And then when you go online, you can see how those compare with students from other regions of the world. I'm just going to show you one more flag and then I'm going to open it up for questions because we're running low on time, but I love this flag. This is not a flag from Mexico. This is a flag from Reading, Pennsylvania, by a 7th or 8th grade student. By the way, the flags are not supposed to have their names on them. You'll see in some of the gallery they do, but they should be relatively anonymous for security purposes. But this flag, there's no recording, so I'll read it. It says, "In my dream, there is no plastic in the ocean, clean water and sanitation. In my dream, people have food, zero hunger. In my dream, people are safe, healthy, and well. In my dream, girls and boys go to school, quality education. In my dream, people have freedom, peace, justice, and strong institutions. In my dream, everyone has a goal to accomplish." So, and you can notice that the flags she put are flags from the Caribbean, right? So I don't know anything about this student. I wasn't the teacher who facilitated this flag making, but it's perhaps maybe she has relatives that are from the Caribbean. Perhaps she's from there herself. We don't know, but it's kind of cool that she represented that about herself on the flag. So with that, you know, you can feel free to peruse the Dreamline website yourself. There's also information about it in the guide. And yeah, I'll turn it over to Romina again if you'd like to say anything before we open it up for questions.
Yes, thank you, Amanda, for everything. Again, it's always a pleasure to listen to all your ideas, to your activities. I am I really like this last activity, so I hope it's useful to everybody here, especially in this context, because you can use the app and you can just engage with your students and make them engage with each other and with other schools even. So yeah, so all of what Amanda said is in the guide. I really want to open the floor to questions, comments, anything. We just value exchange between us, especially if we're a manageable group, like Amanda said. So please, if anybody has anything to say, please go ahead.
Okay, so I see a question. If not in English or Spanish, what languages are the writings translated into? I'm assuming you're asking about the Dreamline project. That's a great question. I haven't looked at the whole gallery, so I would assume that most of the flags are translated into English, just because it is, you know, kind of a lingua franca of sorts of the world. But I don't think Dreamline has any kind of policy on that. In fact, it's up to the teacher leader of the group who you know, to oversee that process. Although there are different ways they can also send facilitators to your school if that's an option you want. But I think, you know, as teachers, it's kind of easy to facilitate yourself. And so that could be, I'm going to share my screen again just so I can show you. Even though English is often the language of translation, there are other languages represented. So there's this, where is it? This flag, which is, this student chose to write in Arabic and translate it into English, but he spoke it in Arabic. So I think Jeff, the founder of Dreamline, is really into this, like kind of promoting multilingualism. It wasn't like an original goal, but we found out that it works really well. So I think it's kind of, you know, the world is our oyster in terms of the languages that could be represented there.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you. And thank you for the questions. I don't know if anybody has any other comments. The people that are joining us from Latin America, or the people that are joining from other parts of the US, or even here. We would love to hear you.
I don't even know like where here is anymore. So I'm not actually not in New York City right now either.
Oh, there we go. Yes, well, I guess it's my here. You're right. Yes, well, something interesting about the guide is that it's meant for the New York City context, but I think that this speaks to many realities, and it's interesting for so many, not only language teaching, it's really useful for other subjects as well when it comes to translanguaging and culture. It's very, very good. Thank you. And also, if you have your guides open, you can look into the From Latin America to chapter, if you want to call it. Also, it's just an example of how each activity. I hope I'm back. Okay, I think I froze, but so I was saying that some of the the reality of Latin America and the Caribbean, just examples, but there are so many just knowledge, right?
Sorry, Romina, I didn't catch all of that, but I think what you're pointing to is
knowledge, right?
Yeah, so there's quite a bit of context in the From Latin America to Your Classroom sections around maybe school system. There's one section on the intercultural bilingual education system in Latin America that exists in many countries. I think that's what you were trying to say. So someone is asking for the link to the presentation again. I can copy it and repaste it in the chat box. There we go. So, I mean, if no one has any comments or questions this evening, I believe my email is listed in the guide, and so is that of Romina. So feel free to reach out if you'd like.
Okay, yeah, so if nobody else has anything to say, so let me just share with you. You already have the link to the guide. ELAS, all our guides are on ELAS's website right there. You just need to look at okay, so let me see if we can do this. So ELAS's website. I'll share it with you. And you can also find our previous guides there. If you have any comments or questions, I'm about to share the email with you. It's also in the guide. Actually, let me share the email with you first because it's easier.
Yeah, and if I could just say, Beatriz, especially if you're, need more resources around students with interrupted formal education, last year's guide is actually linked to in my guide, and it's a wonderful resource. I mean, it's based in New York City, so it might not completely apply to your context, but there might be helpful information or activities in it for you. So.
Yes, exactly. Thank you so much for that. So here it is. There is the website, and well, if nothing, well, thank you very much for being here.